Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and today we're reviewing Asia's Cauldron, the South China Sea and the End of a Stable Pacific, written by Robert Kaplan in 2014. The topic of this book is the South China Sea and the countries that are involved. So you have China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Kaplan is a neo-realist, but I'm gonna say this is the best work I've read written by a realist. Maybe one of the best geopolitical works I've read so far, and I'll tell you why. So in Kaplan's introduction, he talks about the South China Sea. You have a chain of islands that are in dispute there. You have, for example, the chain of islands called the Spratly Islands. Some have been taken by Vietnam, some by Malaysia, some by the Philippines, some by Taiwan, and some by China. And these smaller countries, to balance against China, they need the United States backing them. And this conflict is not really about morality. These countries are a little authoritarian. They're democratic for the most part, but they're not democracies in the Western style like Europe. And the reason that this is a geopolitical interest for the United States is that they have freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Specifically, there's the Malacca Strait here. And much more trade passes through the Malacca Strait than both the Suez Canal and Panama combined. So you need this region to be open and stable to facilitate trade. The world markets are dependent on it, so it's in the United States geopolitical interest to do so. Now with the emergence of China, you have a more multipolar world. So the US has been a distant hegemon in East Asia, but now you have the rise of China, which may make it a bipolar region now. Kaplan emphasizes that Navy and Air Force are much more important in the South China Sea than the Army. There's less likelihood to be a conflict because of the nature of navies compared to the Army. And Kaplan compares this to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is the United States' backyard and was the springboard to making it a global superpower, while the South China Sea for China is viewed as the key geopolitical interest for it, and they believe in the 9-dash line or the cow's tongue, where they claim all islands within that line. Problem is you have a lot of other countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Taiwan, who claim these islands themselves. First country Kaplan analyzes is Vietnam. Vietnam's nationalism is based exclusively basically on being anti-Chinese, and they're a de facto American ally. They opened diplomatic relations with America in 1995. They trade a lot with China, and you have an economic boom in Saigon now. They still have some corruption though, but they have the capability of being a mid-level power in the coming decades. Related to China, in the Gulf of Tonkin, they have had an agreement with China where basically Vietnam runs half of it and China runs the other half. So Vietnam really wants the United States there. And Kaplan talks about Malaysia, which is a multi-civilizational country. Since it's majority Malay, it's 60% Muslim, but you have a large Indian and Chinese minority there. And under the reign of Mahathir Mohamad in the 80s and 90s, you had a large-scale economic growth, but he also discriminated against the Chinese. But thanks to him, in large part, Malaysia is one of the wealthier countries in East Asia. So you have a large middle class in Malaysia today. It used to be only Chinese people in the middle class, but now you have a lot of Malays also in the middle class. And Kaplan also talks about the phenomenon under Mohammed that you have had moderate Islamization in Malaysia. Women are a bit more conservative there in how they dress. Men have a specific dietary restriction. And Malaysia is seen as a model for the rest of the Islamic world. As Malaysia is a democracy, they tolerate the religious minorities for the most part, since it's only 60% Muslim, so there's no super majority really of Muslims dominating as in other Islamic countries. And a lot of the educated elite that governs the Middle East today, such as high-ranking members in Turkey, they have been educated in Malaysia. So Malaysia is one of the important centers for Islamic theory. And despite the anti-minority policies that have been implemented by Mohammed, it's still a relatively peaceful place in the region. There isn't really any insurgency in Malaysia. And Malaysia doesn't really care about the South China Sea conflict, so they're mostly neutral in it. Robert Kaplan then talks about Singapore and the concept of benevolent autocrats. So he views Mahathir Mohamad as one of those, but he thinks that Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore epitomizes this concept. And Lee Kuan Yew ruled from the 60s to the 80s in Singapore and took it from a poor country to a really wealthy one. Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, if not the wealthiest country in the world. And Singapore is multi-ethnic like Malaysia, but Singapore uses English and it encourages integration between Malays, Chinese and Indians. So Lee Kuan Yew is really a man you can appreciate for how he has stabilized and made Singapore a wealthy place. It's not really a democracy, but it's still quite liberal, and it has the Confucian work ethic there. And it's partially an American ally. They want the status quo of the United States in the South China Sea to keep China in check, but they still have close economic ties with China. Singapore is basically a business state and it's dependent on the Malacca Strait being open for free trade. Kaplan then talks about the Philippines, how it's a very corrupt country today. It's maybe the poorest large country in Southeast Asia. It had a dictator for 20 years until the 80s called Ferdinand Marcos, who governed it as a corrupt country. But when it transitioned to democracy, the Philippines in the 80s, it went from a corrupt dictatorship to a corrupt democracy. They have a constant insurgency in the southern Philippines of Muslims there. The unique thing with the Philippines is they focus more on their army than their navy to keep the country united. As the government is weak and you have separatism constantly, and there's no real national identity. So China views the Philippines as a joke, and they start to steal some islands from the Philippines. And the Philippines have a very bad military since it's such a poor country. The US gives them a bunch of military technology, but it's outdated since the Philippines cannot handle anything better because they don't have the cyber technology to do so. And the Philippines is heavily dependent on US backing and their former American ally. You have the rise of other countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore. The Philippines, it's just bad. And the final country that Kaplan talks about is Taiwan. He talks about the first ruler of Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, who retreated to Taiwan after losing the Chinese Civil War. He talks about though Chiang was badly presented in the media in the past, in reality he was a decent leader. You can compare him to Mohammed. He was not as good as Lee Kuan Yew, but he was still beneficial for his country in the long run. So initially he was authoritarian. He left a pretty decent legacy. You had strong economic growth in the 60s and 70s. In the 90s, Taiwan became a vibrant democracy. Taiwan does not dispute the 9-dash line that China claims, but Taiwan views itself as China, so it wants these islands and it controls some of them. There's close economic relationships between China and Taiwan, but in practice Taiwan is an ally to the United States, and China wants the US to get out of there because China wants to reclaim Taiwan, but Kaplan does not think this is really likely. Whether China can reclaim Taiwan is dependent first on the fact that the United States has to withdraw from waters between China and Taiwan. And another thing he points out, it's really hard to invade islands, so it's unlikely that Taiwan can successfully be invaded. Who knows, Taiwan could badly evolve and maybe could reunite with China, but it's not really that likely. So what are Kaplan's conclusions? So there's possible conflict in the region, but as this involves navies, it's not as likely. The choice for the smaller countries here is whether to balance with aligning themselves with the USA against China or to bandwagon with China. And Robert Kaplan believes that they will bandwagon with China only if the United States withdraws from the region. It's true the United States has decreased its navy there. The United States has in recent years viewed East Asia as more and more important. Either the United States maintains the status quo, or we have Finlandization of these smaller countries like Vietnam or Singapore or Taiwan. So how would I rate Asia's Cauldron? I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. This could be my favorite geopolitics book I've read so far. Kaplan writes in such an objective and balanced way. He acknowledges many possibilities. He talks about the need for the United States in the region, how some of these countries have developed and are US allies but are kind of economically dependent on China. He talks a lot about the internal dynamics of these countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, and Taiwan. It's a very interesting read, and he has a lot of personal anecdotes here as he has traveled to these countries many times. This is maybe the best geopolitics book you could read, although it's kind of specific to the South China Sea. But if you want to read something about East Asia geopolitics, read Asia's Cauldron. Great job, Robert Kaplan. I want to read more of your books. If you're interested in more geopolitics books, then I would recommend you to check out my review of The Power of Geography by Tim Marshall. It's a good book, not as good as Asia's Cauldron, but still an interesting read to learn about different countries and how their geopolitics are evolving. Anyways, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you next time.